Good evening. Tonight's topic is an important one from a number of points of view. First of all, it's important just in terms of learning about addiction. When people walk in here the first time, they walk in with attitudes about alcoholism and drug addiction. And most of the time, in order to truly understand the topic, you really have to begin to shift, wonder about, play with, toy with your attitudes about the topic. Lots of people think that it's some kind of a moral issue or a symptom of a psychiatric disorder, but you don't understand it until you begin to appreciate it as a primary disease. Attitudes. Attitudes are important in terms of just learning about addiction. They're also important recovering from it. We talked a couple of weeks ago about what's recovery about, and it's about change. And when you ask, well, what kinds of changes? The answer is all kinds. One, most especially, are changes in attitudes. Even if you were the picture of mental health before you started drinking and drugging, you're not likely to end a picture of mental health. You will have been changed. And one of the significant changes are changes in attitudes. Shift in the direction of cynicism and anger and guilt and shame and all those other kinds of things that if you don't change them, you'll have some difficulty recovering. So attitudes are important. Learning about addiction, recovering from it, for both addicts and their families. Again, an addict who doesn't change his attitudes is likely to find recovery fairly miserable. If he's stuck with the idea that, alcohol was the gift of God that gladdens the hearts of men, what he's going to experience is loss. The loss of a significant object in his life. For families, it's equally important that they begin to look at their attitudes. If they think that addiction is a moral problem, then they think that recovery is about change and forgiveness on their part, but not even that so much as they have to change their attitudes toward this kind of monster that it is. So, attitudes, key, as part of recovery for addicts and for their families. So we start with a definition, some simple way of looking at attitudes. An attitude isn't a feeling. Feelings come and go. You may be angry this morning and by this afternoon it's gone. Attitudes are different. Attitudes are longer lasting. The first thing we know about them is that attitudes are not inborn. As far as we know, no doctor has ever delivered a baby, smacked it on the ass, and the baby said, "I hate spinach." To learn to hate spinach is a learning process. It's not a part of your genetic code. What's important about that, of course, is that what is learned can be changed. So to say, well, I can't help that, that's my attitude, is to miss an important truth about attitudes, namely that they were learned and so they can be changed. Now, one of the problems with changing them happens to be that we learn them very early in life, and we learn them both from our parents. Parents are great communicators of attitudes. I would bet that most people in this audience, or at least a good many of them, recognize that they've opened their mouth and what comes out sounds just like their father or just like their mother. And if your parents have not transmitted their attitudes towards you, you may have learned your attitudes in opposition to them. You end up saying, "I don't care what I believe as long as it's not like my father." So your father had a great deal to do with shaping your attitudes. Your attitudes were shaped in opposition to his. But we not only learn our attitudes from our parents, One of the great purveyors of attitudes, especially when we start talking about drugs and alcohol, is culture. The attitudes that you walk around with today are very likely, especially about drugs and alcohol, are very likely to be American 21st century attitudes. And that makes them kind of sneaky. Attitudes aren't taught, they're caught. You pick them up. And so, your attitudes are ingrained, and yet you're never really sure where you picked them up. And that's part of what makes them feel normal, natural, is because you learned them so early, and you learned them in such a subtle way that you didn't realize that there was a learning process going on. Next thing I want to tell you is that attitudes aren't logical. Attitudes are visceral. They're at gut level. We don't have attitudes because we reason that our attitudes are correct. We just sort of pick them up. In fact, our notions about alcohol aren't ones that our parents taught us. They're probably attitudes that you picked up before you even picked up a drink. You saw them on television. You heard Johnny Carson be teased about his drinking, and Dean Martin, and you saw John Wayne drink, and you can tell how old I am because I've got all these old folks that I use as examples, but I know those are the ones that really help shape my attitudes. So they're not logical, they're visceral. They're kind of at gut level. And they're not fleeting or weak. I would define, in fact, an attitude as a learned, emotional stance. And the best way to illustrate that is, in fact, with bicycles. We make two kinds of bicycles. Why? Does it make sense? Well, it did at one time make sense. At one time, when the bike, in fact, was invented, women were wearing long skirts, and so there was a bicycle manufactured specifically to suit the long skirt, so a woman wouldn't have to lift her leg over that bar. She could rather daintily step in to the bicycle. It's been a very long time since you've seen a woman in a long skirt ride a bicycle. The reason for the two manufacturing bikes has gone a long, long time ago. Do we still make two bikes? Yeah, we still make two bikes. I'll tell you one thing, both an engineer and a manufacturer will tell you that makes no sense. One of those models is stronger. From the engineer's point of view, he knows that one of those models is stronger. And the manufacturer will tell you, quite frankly, that it's easier to make one model than to shut down your line, retool, and then make another model. So from either of those 2 points of view, engineer and manufacturer, we still make two bikes. Isn't that silly? Kind of silly. We could save ourselves some money. Not only that, are they still considered sex appropriate? That one of those is for males and one is for females. You want to hear something even sillier than that? Guess which one is made for males? Does that make sense? Anyone with a primitive appreciation for human anatomy will know almost immediately who's going to be hurt if they fall on that damn thing. And yet, we're still making that bike, and we're still for males. You either should switch it or just go with one model. But there they are. And guess what? You wouldn't buy your daughter one of those, and you wouldn't buy your son the other. Even though the, quote, female version makes a lot more sense for boys. You don't want kids making fun of your kid if he has a girl's bike. So it influences, attitudes influence behavior. They influence the choices we make. And sometimes they're just downright nutsy. It makes absolutely no sense. So an attitude is essentially a learned emotional stance. It's not just a feeling. You could be angry this morning and it's gone by this afternoon. All right? Attitudes hang on. They last for a while. They sometimes last a lifetime. And they are tremendously influential in terms of life choices that you make, you know. You've got to realize that attitudes had something to do with the school subjects that you chose to excel in. In fact, psychologists tell us that we know by the time we're 5 or 6 years old what's male appropriate and what's female appropriate. We know that very early in life. It probably had something, and in fact there's data to prove this, with whether or not you decided to excel in mathematics or in language. True? May have influenced your choice of college or university. I used to work helping kids to make that decision. And I would have a kid come in and say, well, I decided to go to this school. And I'd say, well, why? He said, I like the way it felt. I said, does it have the program you want? No. I don't know. Have you investigated the faculty, see where they got their degrees and in what? No, it doesn't matter. So why the hell are you going to go there? Sometimes the answer was, my girlfriend's going there. Geez, that's a wrong decision, isn't it? The 3 important questions in life are, who am I, where am I going, and who will go with me? And you better not answer them in a reverse order. And yet, lots of people are influenced. I'll bet your attitude had something to do with the guy or the gal you were attracted to. The one you chose to marry. How many children you decided to have. Somebody said, oh, they're just attitudes, they don't matter. I said, sweet Murphy, they do matter. You know, they influence lots of things that we choose to do with our lives. I had a friend named Ralph, and he kept saying to the rest of us, I need help finding a house. I want a house that suits my needs. And we asked him, well, what are those needs? And he said, well, it has to be 1 floor. It has to have a mother-in-law apartment. It has to be low maintenance. And he went through this list of things. And then he topped it all off with, it has to be on the water. And we said, Ralph, you're not going to find this home. You're going to have to build this home. Good luck. So about a month later, Ralph calls us and says, I found a house. We said, great. When's the housewarming? He said, oh, I'm not going to buy it. You found that house with all this specification, you're not going to buy it? Yeah. I said, why? He said, location. I said, where is this thing located? In the depths of hell? And he said, no. And then he mentioned a part of this city that when he was 6 years old, he learned that people like him didn't live there. That was another class of people. I said to Ralph, have you ever looked at that place today? I mean, my God, Ralph, that was 56 years ago. And he said, no. I said, well, you better investigate it. And he investigated, and he said, my God, it's really changed. I said, yeah, but you've made a choice based on an attitude that you had when you were 6. So these things are kind of important, all right? A learned emotional stance. An attitude, next thing I want to tell you, an attitude is a judgment. Whenever we might have 35 words to describe attitudes, but for novices like us, we keep it very simple and say, when it comes to it, there are only 2 attitudes. And sometimes they're not expressed in words. Our attitudes are either yay or nay, right? It's a judgment we make about something. You pick out a topic, and you might say thumbs up or thumbs down. You might just go, Or, yeah. Attitudes aren't always expressed in words. Let me give you an example. I'll give you 3 sentences. I'm going to ask you if they all mean the same thing. I'm getting married tomorrow. I'm getting married tomorrow? I'm getting married tomorrow. Now, if you knew a foreigner who wanted to know what those 3 sentences meant, would you inform him accurately if you said, well, he's just getting married, that's all? You know damn well that's not the case, right? Because those 3 sentences, even though they're not a single word different in the sentences, one says, yeah, the other says, really? And the third one says, shit. They have 3 completely different meanings. Based on what? The communication of an attitude. And a communication that doesn't have to do with words exactly. It has to do with a shrug of the shoulder. So keep it simple. An attitude is either this or that. All right? When you're first. And then the question is, of course, if an attitude is a judgment, what you have to have when you make a judgment is a yardstick. In other words, when you have an attitude, you take a look at a piece of the world. I'm going to use the example of bow ties because I had a good friend, one place I worked, who always wore a bow tie. One of our colleagues said to him, Patrick, where'd you lose the bow tie, would you? I said to Patrick, he's got a bow tie yardstick. He's made a judgment about your bow tie based on some way to measure bow ties or clothing or appropriate clothing. So you need 2 things. You need something to judge and a yardstick to judge it by. You can't say, I have an attitude toward my uncle. Too vague, too broad. You have to narrow that down. It's better if you say, my uncle's outlook on politics pisses me off. All right? That's better. That gives us a focus. It's on that particular set of attitudes. And you've got a yardstick. You got a yardstick. So it works a little like this, that, I want to be your friend, but you're too young. And I'd like to be your friend, but you're the wrong color. And I'd like to be your friend, but you're probably a little older than I'd prefer. And I'd like to be your friend, but you wear your hat backward. Damn, I'm lonely. I wonder why. Well, you're lonely because you've had a yardstick and you keep slapping it up against the world and no one measures up. No one measures up. So you end up pretty isolated because your yardstick has been a little strict. You know what you can do with that yardstick? You throw it away. It's chosen. You are free to do with that yardstick whatever you wish. It was not forced on you, it was learned. That attitude was learned. So you can throw it away. Now, if you're like me, the yardstick that you throw away today, 2 days later, damn thing's in your back pocket again and you're using it again. So what you might have to do is you might have to take that yardstick and throw it away again and again and again and again until one day you realize that, I haven't used that way of judging the world. It's not a part of me anymore. I have unlearned it. I have the right to change it. I have a choice about my yardstick. So I saw Patrick's picture on the internet, and the sucker's still wearing a bow tie, and I told him, I'm glad. I'm glad. Our attitudes are culturally learned. And if I could take you on a trip throughout the world, I could show you some rather amazing images of beauty. So take a look at a topic like beauty, in which in a particular culture you always think that, well, it's universal. Everybody across the face of the earth thinks this way. We all have the same ideas about beauty. But trust me, that's not the case. Those are some of the images of beauty that you'll see if you take a trip around the world. Now, we look at some of those and we think, oh my God, there's an African tribe that does that to women when women reach puberty. They cut and burn their skin. It's cauterizing the skin. And they do it in a pattern, and we look at that and we say, oh my God, someone's so primitive and so savage that would cut and burn the human body in order to attain a notion called beauty. They must be primitive. But you know damn well there's a teenage boy in Africa who's saying, look at the scars on that one. Damn, she's hot. Now, I don't know if they say that in Africa, but or cold, or cool, or neat, or whatever. Kind of interesting, you know? It doesn't go around the world. They lengthen necks in Burma. They still do it, by the way. To the point now that if you took the rings away, the woman would have some difficulty holding her head up straight because she's dependent on the hoops. That's not forced on her. That's a choice. She made a choice. We think it's ugly. You know that there's a Burmese man who has looked at her and said, Jesus, look at the rings on that one. Actually, she hasn't stretched her neck. She's collapsed her shoulder girdle. But they can get 12, 15, 18 inches long. Pretty brutal. You know, in China, they bind feet, right? They actually prevent growth. The feet are damaged. They don't think it's ugly. They do it because they think it's beautiful. Native American forehead shape, and they do this to males, by the way. So it's not just women who are subject to this. So we go around the world and we get out west and we see that they take a child when the head is still soft and malleable, and they strap a board, and by increasing the pressure, they reshape the forehead. Savage, huh? They don't think so. They think that's rather cool. That's attractive. There's scarring and tattooing and tribal tattooing. All variations, all kinds. They color the face. They recolor the face. In Africa, there's lip stretching. Ugly, isn't it? They don't think so. Lip adornments, nose enhancements. You know, just thank God we Americans don't alter the human body in order to achieve some notion of beauty. Oh, we don't? Well, wow, then how do you explain this? You know who that is, don't you? He's not a kook from San Francisco. He's a quarterback. Some rather fancy tattooing. Lord rest her soul, but you know, she transformed herself. She had all kinds of plastic surgery to go from what's on the left to what's on the right. Some very painful stuff. Till finally she ended up, unfortunately, looking like a mask. She, to her credit, teased about it. Sort of everywhere. Famous singers covering the body. We do it to the lips, and we do it to the nose, and we do it to both, and we do it to the lips, and we do it to the on the seventh day, God created woman, and I'm convinced on the eighth day, he probably invented basketballs. There's a child's game out called plastic surgery. It allowed children to mess around with this. So the notion that we don't do it is so far from the truth, it's not funny. because we have learned cultural attitudes toward beauty. And some of them are pretty damn crazy. So guess what? We have attitudes toward alcohol. Now, where did you learn them and when? The answer is probably, you probably don't know where you learned them or from whom or how you learned them. You just grew up with some kind of attitude. I don't know what it is. And they often range from the gift of God that gladdens the hearts of men to the devil's brew. Okay? And alcoholics the same way. So let's take a look at some of the attitudes that you probably learned. You've probably learned that alcohol is, first of all, it's commonplace. Everybody does it. It's harmless. Have you ever heard anyone say, or have you said yourself, God, we were worried Johnny was into drugs. Thank God it wasn't drugs, it was just alcohol. Anybody ever heard that? I heard it plenty of times, sure. And it's because we think alcohol is, oh yeah, well, we know it can harm you, but, not really. I mean, can it really, really harm you? Well, you'll see in a second, it can really, really harm you. It's almost magical. It's almost magical in the effects that it has on people. We think of it in some remarkable ways, and pretty much all purpose. Got a problem? Take a drink. The notion that everyone does it is simply not true. I saw this poster somewhere, liquor is legal, not compulsory. And if you look at statistics, what you realize is that American consumption, about 65% of Americans drink, 35% don't drink at all. So the notion that somehow, we are a heavy drinking culture flies in the face of data. Results from the 2012 National Survey on Drug Abuse and Health found that, here's what they found, that those statistics indicate percentage who used in the past month. The gray is binge but not heavy use. The blue is heavy alcohol use. And the white is current use. So what you'll notice from the chart is that even at its peak, when you're looking at those from in that age group 21 to 25, that only 14% are heavy users, 45% are heavy alcohol users. The other 45% are binge users, but not heavy. The white is current users. But what you also got to realize is that what that also means is that 31% are not users in that age group. So the 21-year-old who says to you, everybody drinks the way I do, is not telling the truth from a statistical point of view. You'll notice as time goes on, too, that fewer and fewer people end up drinking. By the time they get in, some friends of mine, only 60-some% aren't drinking anymore. And they're not all in AA, I'll promise you that. So that notion that, we're all heavy drinkers, college and above reach sharp peaks, but some mature out. Not everyone that you went to college with in your freshman year drank that same way by their junior year. And even further, and even less in their senior year. And how many of you know some college mates who by the time you'd graduated had matured out, that they stopped drinking either heavily or daily or any of the other, occasionally? How many of you know some people like that? So it's true. Some people do mature out. Others don't, of course. There are some who, keep drinking that way damn near for a lifetime. And some get sick about it. So the second notion that a lot of people end up with is that alcohol's harmless, you know. Jesus, we were afraid Johnny was into drugs. Thank God it wasn't drugs. It was just alcohol. That fails to recognize some pretty hard facts. Here's one of them. Which of these two drugs does more harm to the human body? Alcohol or heroin? Which does more physical damage? Alcohol. You see two patients walk into treatment. Both are addicts. One's an alcohol addict and the other's a heroin addict. And by the time you get their physicals done, the one who's physically sicker is the alcoholic. The heroin addict will be sick if he doesn't eat, and some of them don't. But even if the alcoholic is eating, he's still wasting the energy from food because the alcohol takes its place. So the truth is that of the two, the alcoholic's always going to be sicker, physically sicker. Right? So harmless? Which of these two withdrawals is the more serious withdrawal? So if they're going to go into withdrawal, which one is taking a hell of a risk? Which one do you think, alcohol or heroin? Most people say heroin. The answer is nope. Once again, it's alcohol. Okay? Heroin withdrawal is prolonged and painful, but withdrawal itself is never fatal. Now, heroin addicts may die while in withdrawal from heroin, but not from withdrawal from heroin. A heroin addict will be in withdrawal, walk across the street and a car hit him. Or he's in withdrawal and he takes another dose of his drug, he doesn't know how potent it is, and overdose kills him. Okay? He's in withdrawal and he goes to meet his supplier, and the supplier asks for money, he doesn't have it, and he shoots him and he's dead. But never from withdrawal. Death is not the medical consequence of withdrawing from heroin. That's not my information. A doctor who ran the methadone maintenance program here for more than 35 years used to tell his patients, you know, heroin withdrawal will not kill you. It may make you wish you were dying, but it won't actually do the job. All right. Now here, what's the so alcohol is more harmful to the body, and its withdrawal is more potent. And which one do we call the hard drug? Isn't that interesting? See, heroin withdrawal, you know, lasts 28 days. All kinds of GI problems. You get diarrhea and everything else. Alcohol withdrawal, if it involves DTs, delirium tremens, if DTs start, now the doctors keep them from starting by loading you up with a counteractive drug. So usually a withdrawal from a narcotic will be something like Librium or a barbiturate, depends on the doctor, which he wants to use. But those who start DTs, so you can prevent them from starting. But if they start before you've tried that, the percentage who die in heroin withdrawal from DTs goes from like 3 to 15%, depending on whose statistics you look at. So alcohol withdrawal is the more dangerous. Alcohol does the more physical damage, and yet we call heroin the hard drug. What seems harder to you, dead or diarrhea? See, I pick diarrhea every goddamn weekend, all right? Dead ruins your weekend, all right? So it's a crazy attitude, and it doesn't bear resemblance from the truth, to the truth. Alcohol is magical. You know, we think that it's both a pick-me-up and a tranquilizer. That's got to be magic. They say, here, drink this, it'll pick you up. The following day they say, here, drink this, it'll settle you down. And you start wondering, what the hell does this shit do? If it both picks you up and settles you down, it must be magic. This must be magic. We use it to celebrate the thrill of victory. or relieve the agony of defeat. We won, let's drink. We lost, let's drink. We didn't play, shit, let's drink it. It doesn't matter. We use it to bind friendships and to relieve loneliness. So we find it equally effective for opposites. That's magic. That's magic. And this is the one that blows me away. We think it's equally effective as an aphrodisiac as an anesthetic. So here we are claiming that it'll perk it up and numb it out. We've got to do one or the other, all right? It's not capable of actually doing both. But that's the way we think about it, right? We drink it to relieve pain and have sex. Here's one of our attitudes. It's in vino veritas. That's a Latin phrase, so we go way back with this attitude. It's not truth in wine, it's drug. Alcohol isn't a truth teller. It's not a disinhibitor, and so has the truth emerge. You got to ask this question. Alcohol is a toxin, system poison. Alcohol isn't digested, it's oxidized. So when you drink alcohol, the brain does not register it as a food and says go to digestion as the process. The brain recognizes it as a poison and sends it to the liver, where it's going to be oxidized, rendered from a potent poison to carbon dioxide and water, and then from carbon dioxide and water, and then you breathe and urinate it out. Does poison reveal the truth? If I just give you a little poison, will I get the truth out of you? Not enough to kill your ass, but just enough to loosen you up. Will I get the truth out of you? Will I get the truth out of you after you've had surgery, you're in the recovery room, and you're pumped full of drugs? Should I go ask you questions about whether you loved your father and hated your mother? I still go back there saying, no, of course not. Why? Because I'm poisoned. You can't find out the truth from a poisoned person. That's a fundamental decision you have to make. Does poison reveal or does poison distort? Fundamental question. Poison distorts. The natural condition of the brain is not poisoned, okay? Although I had a patient once who kind of thought that alcohol was a natural substance for human beings, and teaching a lesson on blood alcohol levels, I was telling them that at 0.10, you'll feel this, and at a 0.40, you'll be unconscious, and 5.0, half the population will be dead at 5.0. And he raised his hand. He was a little wet at the time, and he said, "What's the natural blood alcohol level?" I said, the normal blood alcohol level is 0. We don't come a little drunk and have to spend our lives sort of making up for it, all right? The natural state is unintoxicated. Interesting word, isn't it? We call it intoxicated, failing to recognize that word toxic means poison. You're going to have to start unlearning your thoughts about drugs. And yet it's difficult. Why? Because, the drug issue, it's not a political issue, and it's not an economic issue, and it's not a, mid-Atlantic issue, and it's not a Maryland issue. The drug issue is a national health issue. And until we start treating it as a national health issue, we're not going to make a whole lot of progress dealing with it. The number 3 health problem, I'm probably going to get these statistics wrong. It's the number 1 health problem, the number 3 cause of death in this country. The number 1 health problem, the number 3 cause of death. Unfortunately, we're also uninsured for its treatment. That most of us don't have enough to cover adequate treatment for that. That sounds wrong-minded to me. If you say to me, this is our number one health problem and number 3 cause of death, I'm going to say, let's fix it. It is conservatively estimated that 50% of all the cases of murder, suicide, fatal automobile accidents, cases of abuse, and successful suicides, did I mention that? Half of all cases are alcohol drug related. Half of all those problems. I was in a little jail in northeastern Pennsylvania. Now I was there as a visitor this time. And I asked the jailer, I said, how many of your clients here are here because of their alcohol and drug use? He looked at me and he smiled and he said, Mister, if I threw the ones out who are alcohol and drug related, I could lock the rest up in the shit house. In other words, they'll fit in the bathroom if I threw the alcohol and drug patients away. I have a Baltimore County cop who's a friend of mine, and he's a crash expert. So I asked him to give me some statistics, and his stats for Baltimore County, when it's the driver who is intoxicated, not the passengers, ranges from 39% and up. So Baltimore County is doing a little better than the national average, but it's still 39%. Kind of interesting, and yet we don't treat this as a health issue. We treat it as a political issue. We have to solve the drug problem, and we think we're going to solve it by arresting people. If you have a two-pronged problem, something which is both illegal and a health issue, the solution has to always be a two-pronged solution. It's got to address both things, not one or the other. Not one or the other. Some addicts have been helped by the legal system. They've been helped because they got caught, all right? And it got them on the road to recovery. It can be useful, all right? It can be useful. But that whole question of, the whole question of which ones should be legal and which ones should not is what we get all tied up in. Or it's about money, and a lot of times it is about money, How much money can we make with, X, Y, or Z drug? Here are some of the drugs of addiction. Recreational use of prescription drugs by teenagers. So some teenagers get the drug out of mom's or dad's medicine cabinet, and they start a process by which they become addicted. Not all of them will become addicted. Only a certain percentage will become addicted. And that doesn't depend on anything except not what drug they're using, but how prone they are to the drug they're using. So not everyone who starts smoking marijuana will end up addicted to it. Some will, and some won't. It's be a percentage of the population for whom that drug is dangerous, terribly dangerous. It's still a potentially addictive drug, don't get me wrong. But how many of you recognize that, how many of you would know a lot of heroin addicts if all the guys you knew in college who smoked pot went that direction? That it was, quote, a gateway drug, which we got told meant it caused drug addiction. You know damn well that marijuana doesn't cause hard drug addiction because you know too many people who didn't have that happen to them. So you can't say to that to a kid. If you start with marijuana, you're going to go on to be a heroin addict. Because he knows that's not true. That doesn't hold up to facts, all right? But these attitudes about drugs are often driven by just that, attitudes. That this drug is evil and that one's not. The drugs can't be evil. Drugs can't be. They can't think. They can't think. So, and you have to be able to think. Beside that, addiction is not in the drug. It's in the drugger's proneness to what's in the drug. If proneness were in the drug, we'd have a whole lot more alcoholics in this country than we have. But the truth is that the rate of alcoholism in this country ranges in the anywhere from 8 to 18%. What that means is that not everybody who drinks alcohol becomes an alcoholic, becomes an addict. And we can't tell lies on Tuesday and expect people to believe us on Wednesday. You can't tell a kid a lie on Friday and then have him believe you on Monday. He's not going to believe you. He knows it doesn't happen. So you do have this story.
I really thought that she was armed with all the knowledge that she would need to stay off drugs.
I would steal pills from my friend's mom.
We talk about all of the common drugs, but never about prescription medication.
In my mind, pills were better than doing meth or coke because they're prescribed. I was addicted to pills and I was living in a car. I stole a bunch of jewelry because I needed money for drugs.
We needed to call the police. But what are their neighbors going to think?
Families can't get too caught up in the idea that my son or daughter, they could be in jail. They could be in the morgue.
Being involved with the law saved my life, really. If my mom hadn't called the cops on me, I don't know where I would be right now.
There's still quite a bit of denial in our community about the problem.
No one talks about it.
It's happening in every city and town across this country.
It could happen to your kid.
What's her life like today?
She's doing very well. She's clean and sober. She's productive. She's sweet. And I have her back, and I'm thankful. And it's wonderful.
To me, that kind of thing sort of successfully refutes the notion that heroin addicts are bad and stupid and evil. Heroin is a dangerous drug simply because physical dependence on the drug. Physical dependence is not the same as addiction, okay? You can be an addict without ever having been physically dependent. There are plenty of alcohol addicts in this world who never had the shakes, but they're fully addicted according to diagnostic and statistical manual criteria. They fit the criteria, yet they never had the shakes. Never had the shakes, okay? So, and it's universal. Alcohol dependence is selective. You have 100 people drink and maybe a dozen or more, maybe even half of them become physically dependent. The others aren't physically dependent, but they match criteria, the toughest criteria the book offers. They've had a pattern of loss of control in the presence of tolerance, who have persisted in using the drug despite multiple problems. If those things have happened to you, you have an addiction. And it almost doesn't matter which drug it is, which drug we're talking. Alcohol addiction, heroin addiction, marijuana addiction, nicotine addiction, right? It's a generic issue. And it doesn't seem to matter a whole lot. Heroin addicts, however, are on the nod. They're not terribly educable because they're sort of like this most of the time. Buprenorphine, Suboxone, have you heard about that drug? It's probably, my notion is, and I've talked to others who think so too, is that it's probably going to take the place of methadone. But it is a narcotic. You get it, however, not from a clinic, but from a private physician. So you don't have to go to a clinic with other narcotics addicts to pick up your drug. You can do it in the privacy of his office. It can only be prescribed by a limited number of physicians determined by state. And each physician who is licensed to prescribe, it is that, buprenorphine, Suboxone, not Subutex. Suboxone doesn't get the patient high. Subutex, they kind of like it. And I'll tell you one thing about addiction. If you're a doctor and you give your patient a drug that makes him smile, you got the wrong patient on the wrong drug. You don't want him smiling when he takes the drug. So its detox is a little easier. And if one size fit all, it would be a wonderful world. But there are some heroin addicts who have the damnedest time getting sober. They relapse chronically. And so you're left with the choice of, who's a good patient, one who's alive or one who's dead. I'm afraid one size doesn't fit all. That's not to say that heroin and buprenorphine are innocuous drugs. They're serious drugs. They're serious drugs. Meth. You end up with what's called meth mouth. You lose your teeth. You scratch your face, and it's replaced by scar tissue. Your cheeks sink. And instead of telling you about that, if you don't have a strong stomach, you might not want to watch this. All right, but I'll try. I have left out some of the tougher ones. Marijuana. It's a drug of addiction. Yeah, people think it's not because it doesn't, quote, cause physical dependence. Well, first of all, physical dependence is not a necessary criteria. You can be called psychoactive substance dependent without ever having to have the shakes. So this notion that the heart of addiction is the shakes, withdrawal, physical dependence, it's not based on the book or the facts. There are plenty of alcoholics who've never been in withdrawal, not for a moment. And you can't be in withdrawal from nicotine because at least it doesn't cause a measurable physical dependence. But you ask anybody who's tried to stop smoking how happy they are, and they'll tell you, "God damn it, I'm happy." Pissed off and angry and irritable. Can't measure it, but they don't feel so hot. Okay, marijuana, you know what the kids have told me all the time. Well, it's natural. To which my response is, so are rattlesnakes, for Christ's sake. A rattlesnake is completely natural. So are sharks, oleander, bees, and rhubarb leaves. They are completely natural. They're also toxic. They're also poison. So don't go eating an oleander blossom. All right? You're ingesting a toxin. So that notion that something that is natural can't be harmful, that's silly. Marijuana is addictive. People lose control of its use. They become tolerant of heavier and heavier doses. And that no matter what happens, they just don't seem to want to be able to or be able to stop. They just can't stop. So yeah, it's an addictive drug. And lately in clinics, you're seeing more and more kids, young adults, whose drug of choice, in fact, in some cases, I had one patient it was his only drug he liked, was marijuana. So you're seeing more and more of that. Benzodiazepines, those are the drugs with names like Valium, Librium, Cirex, Transine, Dolmen, Xanax, Klonopin. They're all, in the old days we used to call Valium freeze-dried alcohol because its effects were so similar, and they're in the same category. They're depressant drugs. We had a group of alcoholics sitting around talking about their adventures with alcohol, and in the midst of all of them, there was a woman who was a Valium addict, okay? When they were all finished, she said to the group, "I'm never going to try alcohol." And one member of the group said, "Why?" And she said, I'd like it too much. I'd like it too much. So I shouldn't even play with that one. So, benzodiazepines with 100 different names are, in fact, addictive. But remember, not everyone who uses a benzo becomes an addict. The question is proneness of the individual, not the nature of the drug. We would see patients at the retreat who were physically dependent on a benzo. They had to be detoxed. But once they were detoxed, they didn't go back to the drug. I had a guy walk in. I tell this story all the time. He asked me, how fast can you get me off this drug? And I said, well, first of all, I'm not going to do that. The doctors are going to do that. I'm here to tell whether or not you're an addict, because we know you're physically dependent. And so the middle of the first week, he asked me this question. He said, can they speed it up? Addicts don't talk that way. If you get a heroin addict in treatment, he'll say, slow down. I need 80. Methadone, a heroin addict on methadone will tell you point blank. In fact, I remember one who did. I need 80. It means if you don't give me 80 milligrams of methadone, I'm leaving treatment. And he'll tell you at the end of the first week, slow down. Slow down. Start at 80, slow down. That's how addicts think about this. LSD, the problem with it is that its potency and predictability. No one really knows once you take a hit how long you're going to be gone from this world, where you're going to travel, and how much drug will it take to take you there. So what's the freight cost? It's pretty unpredictable drug, and it can be terribly scary. The experience can be. First of all, the effect of the drug lasts quite a long time. It's not like cocaine. In cocaine, you snort cocaine, you'll feel it in 20 seconds, it'll be over in 20 minutes. You take a hit of LSD, depending on its potency, you may be seeing numbers breathe, flowers dance, and all kinds of crazy shit. But it might last 6 hours. And at the end of about the 4th hour, you're saying, that's enough. That's enough. I don't like this. I don't like this experience. So it's potent. It's unpredictable. A tolerance develops for it rapidly. That's why some seasoned addicts, it's not their favorite drug because they get tolerant of it too quickly. It's a kind of drug that scares me a little because the effects are so bizarre that you wonder, what is going to be the end result of taking a trip? I worked with a psychiatrist once who had proposed using LSD to imitate schizophrenia to determine which other drug, antipsychotic drug, could reverse the symptoms of a schizophrenic mimetic drug. So it says, this will imitate schizophrenia, and we'll give you stelazine to see how quickly we can reverse the symptoms. So at least at one point, they were pretty leery of that drug. Cocaine. The biggest problem, one of the biggest problems with cocaine, it makes you feel wonderful. And there are some social cocaine users. Close your eyes and raise your hands. How many of you know a social cocaine user? Anybody? And you haven't been around enough. There are some people. I worked with a guy who used it socially and sociably in modest amounts and with no resultant harm. How many of you know a social marijuana user? See, we're not going to get anywhere if we keep lying about this, if we keep hiding what we know. All right? We'll go nowhere. How many of you have known a social marijuana user? Used it socially and sociably in modest amounts with no resultant harm. That's what a social user is. Okay. Now, with some drugs, that gets tough because, for instance, with a narcotic, you don't get a healthy, long window before you're physically dependent. Got it? So it makes you physically dependent pretty rapidly, within 30 days. You're already at the point that if you try to stop, you shake. All right. So these are some of those drugs, that they are drugs of potential addiction. Does everyone get dependent? Does everyone become addicted to all of these drugs? Of course not. How many of you know someone who takes benzodiazepines as prescribed? Valium, Librium, Cerex, they take them as prescribed, for a medical purpose, in an amount and a dose regulated by the doctor, and you stop when the health problem is finished. That's prescription use. And we know people who do that. Again, my point, if you remember nothing else, my point is this. The problem with addiction is not the drug. The problem is the proneness of the drugger. Okay? And not everybody becomes addicted to even drugs which have terrible potential for addiction. Molly, don't be fooled, that's ecstasy. Spice, and ain't parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. It's a kind of a synthetic marijuana. Bath salts, another designer drug, easily modified, and that's the problem with it. You want to say, this is a terrible drug, and before you know it, they've changed the formula. And it's no longer a terrible drug. Or at least it doesn't fit the criteria. So this has become a kind of game in which, drug makers are always trying to find something that's profitable, easy to avoid legal complications, and will make them some bucks. And there are always going to be people who love drugs and want to find ones that are not illegal and safe and not terribly expensive. Not terribly expensive. The heroin problem in Baltimore, at least, has risen because heroin's getting cheaper than the synthetic types that are manufactured. So it's kind of, the attitude has to involve unlearning where the addiction is. And it's a terrible mistake to think drugs are evil, because they're not. All of the drugs that we have mentioned have some use. Have some use. If you have a kid with ADD, thank God Ritalin is available. If you have a patient dying of cancer, you're going to thank God that in some places marijuana is available. If you have a person who has a severe anxiety disorder, you better thank God that there is a Klonopin. All right? Drugs can't be evil. In order to be evil, you've got to be able to think. And these drugs don't think. And the problem isn't the drug. It's the drugger. It's the drugger. So alcoholics, what have been your attitudes toward alcoholics? Well, here's one. You know it as well as I. I got to watch my time here. We have this notion that alcoholics are the Skid Row types. And you know what the truth is? That accounts for 5% of the alcoholic population. Any study of Skid Row has concluded that not everyone is there because of drugs or alcohol. About half of them are there because of drugs and alcohol. 95% aren't on Skid Row. So if you have the notion that they are, and you are one, you're going to fail to diagnose yourself, because you're going to say it's this tiny little piece of the population. At this point, let's take a break, short break. When we come back, we'll continue with this and tell you more about alcoholics.